Hey guys, Eclipse14 here, and welcome back to my little collection desk here. Today we're going to be doing our second part of my 5-part series featuring my entire PlayStation collection. This is the second set of 17 games. We covered our first one, which featured the ones where I didn't have the case for anything, and then some of the more well-known games, as well as some of the more common games. So this one, they're going to be adding a little bit more on the common side, but then we're going to start getting a little more weird as I get farther into this, and then after that, it's just going to get normal from that point onward. So I guess with that said, not much else to say. It's just we continue from where we left off with the 18th game in my entire collection. To kick us off, we have a game called Ape Escape. Now, Ape Escape it was the first game that was actually supposed to take use of the DualShock controller, which was the new controller that was out at the time. It was manufactured in 1998, and since it's become more or less the standard PlayStation controller ever since then. The original PlayStation controllers did not have the analog sticks that we all know. It was just a standard controller. It felt a little bit smaller than usual. And that was really it. After analog started becoming a thing, there was another thing that came out between 97 and 98, and then finally it was perfected with the DualShock, which has been out since 98, so 20 years now, 21, pushing it. So this game was actually meant to utilize the analog stick in the form of the D-pad and the buttons did all the selecting and camera rotations. The analog sticks did everything else. So it was really unusual in its own right. And apparently it was popular enough that Ape Escape became its own little series. Now I bought this thing fairly cheap, and it was on my want list for some time, but I never got to really play around with it because I was working on other things at the time. I played it for maybe 10 minutes to make sure everything was working fine. It does work well, and I might be able to play it at some point in time. I just never got around to it, but it is nice to actually have the first Ape Escape in the collection, and that's really all that matters to me. Next up is Oddworld Abe's Exodus, which unfortunately is another case where I only played it for a couple minutes and that was the end of it. In this case's instance, Oddworld Abe's Odyssey was the first one, and I've never actually played that game. And I've heard Oddworld Abe's Odyssey was actually supposed to be a really good game, and I would play that first instead of Exodus, because Exodus is the second game in the series. It's a 2-disc game. I've got it all, including the, oh, there it is. I was wondering where that was. The speaking piece of paper here. The simplified controls and speak. So that's very nice to have. And then in the back here is disc 2. I can pull it out. There we go. Yeah, this is a game where this was mostly, it was hard for me to really understand because of what everything needed to be done in terms of speaking and all that stuff, so I never really got into it, but I do know, I've heard that the first game was actually really good, and I should play that, so I've been more or less reluctant to play Abe's Exodus before I actually played Abe's Odyssey, so I've been reluctant on playing this in order to find Abe's Odyssey. So I might play this at some point in time once I play and complete Odyssey, but that might be a while before I ever get the chance. Next up is a game called Beyond the Beyond, which is notorious for being a piece of shit. I put that bluntly because that's pretty much what it is garbage. That's what I've heard and everything. I've played it a little bit. Well, actually, no, I've played it for maybe like 2 hours or something like that. I never actually got around to fully playing it, but from what I heard, this was actually the first role-playing game to be released for the PlayStation out in the West. So this was really all I had for a little bit until some of the better stuff came in. But this thing was definitely notorious for being quite a weak game in its own right. And of course, this is the first instance of my entire collection where it's a one disc under a jewel case because the manual's too big. That's actually what was the case for some of these that required a multi-jewel case for one disc. It was too big to have a normal jewel case. So I'd have a multi just to have the manual in, which is absolutely ridiculous. But that's really all that it is. That's really all it is. I don't have a whole lot to say about it, considering that I've only played it for like 2 hours, and even then, there wasn't a whole lot going on. But I do know that it didn't play too well, and the story is just as bland as it can be. I've played so many role playing games that it just doesn't faze me. The thing is, though, this thing is like 30. I think it's like $30 normally, so it's unbelievable why it can be worth that much, but it is, and I have it in the collection because why not? I, it's a piece of garbage. That's all I can say about it. Next off is Heart of Darkness, and Heart of Darkness is a pretty fluid platformer in its own right, kind of like Another World or Out of This World, whatever it's called in whatever country you're in. It's one of those kind of games. The game's 2 discs, and I actually have completed this game from start to finish. I actually only have 2 complaints with this game, honestly. First off, even though it's 2 discs, the game is fairly short. Even with all the times I've died, I've completed it in about 6 hours. 6 game hours, honestly. So it's not very long. And the second thing is, one of the things that's pretty cool that I realized is that it has 3D glasses, and my particular copy is detached because that's how it came in. The problem with the 3D glasses, however, is that they don't really get used in the game. They're only used right at the very end of the game. Once you complete it, and all it is it's a repeat of the second to last scene of the game, just in a 3D motive. So it's just like, really? I played the whole game for this? And that's really my only 2 big complaints about this game. Other than that, it's an excellent little platform in its own right. It's not terribly expensive. I only paid $8 for this thing. And this is definitely one that I would try out if you ever get the chance to see it. There's also a version on PC too, but I have the PlayStation version, and what it is what it is. It's a great game, and I'd recommend it. Next off is Gekio Shooting King. Now, this was in a friend of mine's shop for a very, very long time. No, it never left the shop for like, I don't know, a year and a half or something like that. It just stayed there until it got to a point where I was like, you know what, I'll take it. Well, no one else is getting it, so why not? This turned out to be, it's a top-down shooter. It's not anything really special. It's kind of like Devious or something like that when it comes down to gameplay style. I didn't play it very much though. The only thing that I really remember about it was that there was a number of certain modes you could play the game, and the one I remember first touching was the comedy mode, which if you blew something up, there was a laugh track that played. So I lost my marbles pretty quickly on that one. There's the disc, which is fairly clean. Not a huge amount of problems with it, but I know it's a game that I never really played all that much, considering it's just a top-down shoot 'em up, and they're okay. It's just, for me, it seems more like the horizontal shoot 'em ups might be better in my eyes, but that might be just me just thinking aloud and not much else. But, yeah, Gekio Shooting King for PlayStation. And speaking of Devious, we've got Devious 3D/G+. Now, this game actually involves what was the current Devious at the time, which was Devious 3D. But it also included the original Devious, Super Devious, and something called Devious Arrangement. So you get 4 games in one, and it all seems to actually play pretty nicely. The original Devious is emulated quite well. Super Devious is done pretty nicely. Never actually did try Devious Arrangement in this game, and I should probably do that at some point in time. But Devious 3D was definitely a little interesting. It was pretty early polygon style, and it was more. It wasn't more top down in the instance, as it was more like a top forward kind of thing going on. Kind of hard to really explain, since I especially don't really remember me playing it. This was another instance where I played for like half an hour just to make sure everything worked and all that, and I just never really got around to playing it. Maybe I actually should at some point in time, because seeing original Xevious is kind of nice, and 3D should be pretty interesting. But I forgot to show the disc and everything, so that's the disc. I remember these things being like $50 at some point in time. They've since dropped in price. I think they're like 25, 30 now. It's been a while since I last checked, but they definitely dropped from when I remember it. Not sure if it's increased since then, but I definitely know that that this game is not a very common game at all, and I'm glad I picked mine up when I did. Next up is a game called Wild Arms, which is another instance where the game is only a single disc, and that's because of a very huge manual. But at least this game is good and not like the first game I showed, which was a piece of crap. Wild Arms was something that I didn't know about it very much until I ended up looking at Wild Arms 2 in one shop, which I still don't have to this day. I've been looking for that for a long time now to actually get a copy of that in my hands. I mean, I've seen a couple copies, I just never got it. But I have played this game for quite a couple hours, but I never did finish it. And I haven't actually been hoping to go back to it and try to finish the game, but I never had the time to actually do it. But I've heard that this game and the series in general was actually pretty good. I mean, it should have been, because there were 5 entries in the whole thing. So maybe I might get around to actually being able to play this at some point in time, but as it sits, I just haven't had the chance to do it. Definitely something that I do want to try to at least start and complete. Definitely on the top of my list among a number of games. And hopefully I'll get to it at some point in time for the channel. I'd like to do it for the channel. Next up is another role-playing game that I've heard is actually really good, and know that it's really good, but I ultimately never got to finish. It's The Legend of Dragoon. Now, my original copy of this was actually a greatest hits with just the 4 discs, and I played that for a couple hours at least. Then I got stuck on it and then just never touched it again. I ended up selling it and tried to find a black label version, which I eventually did, but I never got back to actually being able to play it. But I've heard it's actually a really good role-playing game, but it has not aged very well. Not that it matters to me, because I usually can play anything. There's the first disc, which is pretty colorful. The problem with my black label copy is the manual is a bit torn. Has some problems with it, but it's okay. There's disc 2 right there. Flip this, and we got ourselves discs 3 and 4. So, it is nice to actually have this whole thing together, especially in a black label case, because I haven't seen too many black label copies of The Legend of Dragoon, and it's not a very cheap game, but it's not a super expensive one either. So that kind of sucks that I can't really find this game all that much. But this is one that I'm hoping to give a chance sometime soon, but definitely is a little in the middle of the list in this regard, because there's quite a few others that I would definitely have a better time playing than The Legend of Dragoon. I do hope to play it at some point in time, though. Next off is Legend of Balaia, and this is another instance where I only played for a little bit and never finished it. This one in the case was more technical because I have yet to actually replace this particular copy of the game. Another one discer because of a bigger manual, but my biggest problem here is that whatever caked onto the jewel case of this one has caused the back to be an issue, and the disc, unfortunately, while it does play and work, it doesn't really do a whole bunch in the form of the animated scenes, which actually caused the game to freeze and crash. So as a result, I never got to play the game for like 15 minutes or something like that, and that was it, which unfortunately sucks because this is actually an interesting game with the fighting. It's like a fighting game simulator in the form of a role-playing game. And it sucks because I really was interested in it, and I never got the chance to actually be able to play it because the disc doesn't work. And the problem with this game, however, is that this game is not very cheap. The last time I was trying to look for the game, it was like $45 for bare minimum, and usually they were like 60 and 70. I only paid 20 for this, so it's definitely going to be hard-pressed to try to find another copy of this again. Especially since I own the strategy guide for this, and I might get the chance to show the strategy guides at some point in time. Just not now. I really am hoping I can find a disc for fairly cheap, because I really do want to play this game. I'm really, really upset that I just can't do it. Next off is Star Ocean: The Second Story. Now, Star Ocean was originally a Super Famicom game, so we never really recognized this game's existence until our PlayStation port. So, this one is something that I'm not super familiar with, because I did try to play it, and I only played it for a couple minutes, and then I went on to do my own thing, and I just never came back to it. So another one of those examples. I do have both discs. They are in their foil instance. I do know that there is a non-foil case of them. There's a second disc, which is fine. I actually completely forgot about this whole game until some of the characters from the series actually got put onto Final Fantasy Brave Exvius, and I managed to actually get Rena from the second story in that game, so I was really happy with that. But that was, if I remember it correctly, it ended up becoming one of the last 5 stars and the very last limited 5-star base I picked up in that game before I retired. Almost a year ago now. September 3rd was when I stopped playing, due to just a lot of crap going on at the time, and I couldn't do it anymore. So, yeah, it's unfortunate that that's really the only memory I have of Star Ocean: The Second Story. I do want to play this game at some point, but I do know that this is going to be a very time-consuming game, so it's not super high on the list, but it definitely is something worth my time that I've heard. Next up is a game called Galarians. Now, Galarians is something that I didn't really know existed until I just randomly found it at some shop, and then I showed it to some people that definitely didn't recognize it either. So after playing and goofing off for a little bit, I actually decided to give this game a shot, and it's actually a really interesting psychic horror game. But the one complaint I have about this game is that it is extremely short. This is one of only 2 3-discers I have in my entire collection. The other one is going to be on the next episode. And the problem is, disc 1 is only 2 stages long. The second and third discs are only a single stage long. That's how short the game is only 4 levels in 3 discs, which is absolutely, completely stupid. But what I will say is that the game actually did play very well, and the story was actually quite interesting. It's just no one really knows about this game, and that's the unfortunate part. It was definitely difficult to really gauge a price on this game, but eventually it started climbing up in notoriety and as well as its price. If I remember last seeing it correctly, I saw it going for like $25-$30, and this was only 12, so I wasn't too upset. I definitely am glad that I picked up this game. My only complaint, again, is that the game is very short. But it's still a very nice, fun game regardless. And I should actually play this game on the channel when I get the chance to actually get something to play it on. Time for another whammer, and in this instance, it's Clock Tower. Now, Clock Tower's chronology in terms of Japanese and North American releases is pretty weird. I will give it that. So, I don't exactly know what exactly this one is off the top of my head. But what I do know is that the whole idea of it is that there is a guy running around with a pair of friggin' scissors, and you run around England and Norway trying to figure out what the hell's going on. So, this is a game that I didn't really play very much because this is partially point and click, and I'm not particularly fond with point and click games, so I never really played this all that much. But I do know that this game is pretty rare and extremely expensive. Both this and the second game on the PlayStation are outrageous. I actually don't want to say how much I paid for this. This wasn't too cheap. But I have seen this game at least at $100 at some point in time. Bare minimum was usually like 60 or 70. But I do know that the second game, which I did have a chance to get at the same time I got this game, but it ended up passing by me. That game is also very expensive. Usually that's over $100. This one occasionally hits 100. So, whatever the case, this is not a cheap game in its own right. And the game itself really isn't the most exciting horror game out there. There's definitely others. But it is an unusual oddity in its own right, and if you got the chance to get a look at it, I'd say go ahead just to see what you think. And that's really all I can say about Clock Tower. Next game is Super Puzzle Fighter 2 Turbo, which is a freak of nature in its own right, because the whole thought of this even existing just completely blows my mind. This is not like Street Fighter. You're actually it's a puzzle game where you're breaking a bunch of gems, combine them all together, and those actually become the moves to take out your opponent. It's a fairly short game. There's only like an arcade mode and just a simulation mode where you gotta fight everybody in order to get their different skins and whatnot, and that's really all the game is. There is a Sega Saturn version of this game, but I've never actually been able to find that game. It's also a very expensive version, too. So the PlayStation 1 is the cheaper one. But that's not really saying much. I've seen this thing be around 30 bucks plus. So this one I ended up paying around retail at the time, so about 30 bucks. But I'd say it's really well spent because I did put in quite a number of hours into this just for the fun of it. And it's so weird to think that such a thing even exists, but it does. And I know there's a Game Boy Advance game out there somewhere, and I've been looking into that, but I just haven't picked it up. When I get the chance, when I get it, I will get it. But as it sits, this game here is actually what I'm using as a ROM for testing in order to try to get the computer to actually play the PlayStation games. So how it turns out, we'll see what happens, and if it turns out fine, then I might just start playing on that. Next up is Street Fighter EX2 Plus. So this one is a 2D... Well, actually, no. This is a fully 3D fighting game in this instance because you're moving around and all sorts of stuff. This game actually plays okay. Not really a huge fighting game person because they don't last very long. And that's really my only scope, is that they don't last long, so I don't get to play them for very long. And that's really all I gotta say about it. I know this particular game is it's not fairly cheap. It's, I think complete copies of this are around 55 bucks. Not sure exactly why it's so high in this instance, but like, Marvel versus X-Men and Street Fighter versus X-Men, because those ones I could recognize, they are actually very freaking expensive, but, this one's quite high for, I'm not really sure about the reason, but it is a fairly expensive game. So I am glad I have it, but I really don't have a whole lot to say about it because, for one thing, it's a fighting game, so I don't get to play a huge amount of it, and second of all, it's freaking Street Fighter. Do I really need to explain that, honestly? The next game is Darkstalkers III, which is one of only 9 games in my entire PlayStation collection that I did not find out in the wild. I actually had to order online because I could never find this game. Now, being the pansy I am, I learned about the Darkstalkers series through Project Crosszone on the 3DS. And because of that, I actually wanted to try to get into them because I heard they were actually some fairly good fighting games. So I started with Darkstalkers 3 because I thought that would actually be worthwhile. So I ended up ordering this one. Unfortunately, the condition of this one is a little weak. The manual back is gone, but the disc actually is fine. One thing that really caught me off guard about this game was that, unlike other fighting games where if you KO'd somebody, the next round would start and everybody would be back to full health, here the guy will just immediately get up, or you will get up immediately after you're KO'd. It'll be as if you just got revived. And that was the end of it. So it immediately begins the fight, and you could pretty much just pull a last hit if you screwed up. So it is really strange in its own right in that regard. I have been wanting to find the other Darkstalkers games, but they're not very cheap. And if I recall correctly, Darkstalkers 3 is probably the cheapest one of the bunch, but that's not saying much either, because I think this game's risen in price. So I am glad I got this as low as it was at the time. The next game is Rival Schools, which is the second of the 9 online pre-ordered PlayStation games. This one in particular, I have never actually seen out in the wild, and even more so is that even online, it was a pain in the neck to actually find a complete copy of this game. And by complete, I mean there's 2 discs. The arcade disc, which is the arcade layout of the original Rival Schools, the manual, and the second disc, which is the Evolution disc, which is pretty much the same game with a couple different PlayStation exclusive things going on. Most of the time, either one disc was missing, the manual was missing, one of the discs was missing, or both. So it was a pain in the ass to actually find a fairly good deal for fully complete Rival Schools. And eventually, I ended up finding one, and I got that thing on the spot. I did play this game all the way to the end, and that's unlike most fighting games where I don't play it very much. It's just the arcade mode for a little bit, and that's it. This is an instance where I actually played through to the end, and I must say, it was a pretty good game in its own right. I do know that Project Justice was this game's sequel, and that one's more well known, but I've actually yet to play that game whatsoever, and considering how expensive that game is, that's probably not going to happen for a while. Rival Schools in itself is not cheap either. I think a complete copy runs around 70 or 80 bucks at bare minimum. So I am glad I got this when I did, and I definitely got it a little bit cheaper than that retail value. And the 17th and final game of the second set of my PlayStation collection goes to Silent Hill, which is my first Konami PlayStation game. Now, out of all the Konami games that I do own, this is the one I've played the least of, because I'm not... Horror games, they're okay, I just don't really play them all that much. And Silent Hill, I've heard, was actually a very good one. I just never got around to playing it. I played it for maybe 20 minutes or something like that, just to make sure everything worked, and that was about it. I do own the guide for this game, and I know that isn't the cheapest thing out there. And I definitely know Silent Hill, especially in its Black Label copy, is not very cheap either. I think it's like, what, 40 bucks or something like that now. I do know at one point that one shop had it at a very expensive price, and that's really the only reason I even remembered it to begin with, was how high it was just for that in the guide. So getting both much later on and much cheaper was definitely a sight to behold. I should play this at some point in time because I've heard the series is actually pretty good, and it would be nice to start with the first game. And with that, we cover the second set of 17 games that make up my PlayStation collection. So, I guess we're going to go ahead and say stay tuned for part 3, which will be the next 17 games. And this one is one that I will dub the Squaresoft episode because, unfortunately, as much as I love to have 17 Squaresoft games, 16 of them are Squaresoft, so I've got one filler, but I think it'll be an okay filler for that episode. So... stay tuned for part 3, I guess. Thank you all for watching this part. I will see you all on the next one. And otherwise, I will see you on the next video.